Welcome back to this session on global trends shaping power in the 21st century. We want to look a little bit at how power is understood in different regions of the world. What are the key trends that are shaping that thinking? And what does this all mean for the EU? Interested to hear also from our panelists. The EU tends to talk to itself and has a perception of how it is seen by the rest of the world. Is that perception shared by the rest of the world? But we're going to start with a video. One of our speakers couldn't be with us, Suhasini Haidar, National and Diplomatic Editor of The Hindu in India. And I asked her to respond to the two questions that I'll be putting to our panel to start our discussion this morning. And those questions were, what are the most important trends likely to have the greatest impact on shaping the global power balance in the 21st century? And how should these trends, how are they and how should they influence the way EU and other global players think about their place in the world? And going back to the topic of our first panel, the changes that are going to be needed across a wide range of policy areas to respond to those trends. So I'll introduce the rest of our panel later on, but first, let's hear what Suhasini Haidar has to say.
Well, thank you for having me on this special panel, Jacki, and congratulations, of course, to EPC at 25. I've been thinking a little bit about the subject, and really this panel is an important discussion on global trends that are shaping power in the 21st century. And what we can certainly say is 22 years into this 21st century, we appear to be mired in a number of problems that are really going to have a long-term effect if they are not addressed very shortly. The first has been the year-on-year of the global financial issues of economic strife across the globe. Since 2008 in the global financial crisis, what we have really seen is different economies having trouble dealing with it, a certain suspicion of globalization. So we were already dealing with those issues. When we saw what happened next, which was the Russian actions in Ukraine this year and how that war is going to shape the 21st century. Certainly, this is not something that's only happened in 2022. Since the 1990s, we saw a period of relative calm in the 1990s post the Soviet Union between Russia and the West. It really seemed as if Russia and the US and EU could forge some kind of a future together. The Cold War was over. But as of the turn of the century, we've seen growing suspicions between the two, as well as actions by Russia. So if in 2008, we had the Georgian operation, 2014, then there was a Crimean expansion, and then 2022, what we've seen in Donetsk, Luhansk, and so many parts of the Ukraine, the bombing of civilians, as well as the kind of pushback we've seen from the West in terms of arming Ukraine, in terms of sanctions against Russia, in terms of a complete decoupling when it comes to things like the economy, to travel, to allowing people to go back and forth, to the other differences which we are going to see a long-term effect of. Sanctions on energy, sanctions on the exports of other commodities that are made in the region, and as a result, the food, fuel, fertilizer insecurities that have followed. The third has been the issue of climate change, and year on year, we are seeing more and more dramatic outcomes as a result of global warming and the inability of the world to really keep the global warming levels lower. We're seeing heat waves, we're seeing floods, we're seeing drought. Just 2022 showed you what we could see for the rest of the century if something is not done and done fast. And finally, there was the impact of the COVID pandemic that really brought so many countries, so many even developed countries, down to their knees. The worry about new viruses, mutating viruses, that continue across the globe. COVID is not over in that sense. And the question is, what would be next? We're already seeing a country like China still trying to grapple with it, other countries around the world. dealing with the impact of COVID, whether it's been the job losses, the losses in remittances, and other parts of the economy. Where do we need to look next? Really, I think, especially when it comes to global players, the European Union to begin with, but other global stakeholders as well. If the 20th century was about the creation of the United Nations, of multilateral organizations, global liberal Western order, if you like, the globalized economy, international rules of law, current events appear to be reversing that. And I think to begin with, it is important to actually acknowledge the reversal of these globalizing trends. It is important for global players to step up, to stem them. For the EU, it is easier said than done because Europe is in the middle of this war willy-nilly in Ukraine. The divisions we have seen have been political, they've been economic, Russia being cut out of the SWIFT payment system or sanctions, oil sanctions being put on them. It's also been cultural in the mind, a kind of complete decoupling of the societies of Russia as well as Europe over there. We're also seeing the US-China divisions. So US-China, US-Russia, Western Russia, more and more polarization is one of the big trends that's going to shape power. The second, an exit of globalization and an entry of regionalization. Much more regionalization is what we're seeing around the world. Unfortunately, places like South Asia have not been able to create these regional fora as much, but an area like the European Union can certainly teach the world a lot in terms of being able to do interconnected, shorter supply chains, duty tariffs being taken off. But we're seeing it around the world, whether it's USMCA, Mercosur, RCEP, the Gulf region, the Eurasian region, and others. The third is that the United Nations seems to have been tested and has failed. It needs reform, it needs a revival. It certainly needs much, much more in terms of justice, in terms of equal representation for various areas of the world. It does seem a bit strange that the UN Security Council still has only 5 permanent members, none from Africa, none from South America, just 1 from Asia, which is really the geopolitical center in so many ways. The fourth, I think, is that populism is beginning to define foreign policies of countries. Countries are not necessarily behaving as they should in their best interest, but as they should in order to win constituencies domestically. Again, Europe and the US have a particular responsibility in this. Having these more mature democracies, they have to ensure that their actions, regardless of whether it is in their own interests or not, must not enable this majoritarianism and populism that is taking over democracies around the world. And the fifth, I think, when it comes to not just climate change, the COVID pandemic and others, is that the world needs to learn how to reverse our lifestyles, go back to living with less consumption, less travel, less ideas of growth, which mean that year on year, you have to keep doing more, keep selling more, keep growing much more. And instead, given the challenges we're seeing of climate change, learn really to live with less and to be happy with less. I'm sorry that I won't be able to join you for the Q&A part of this discussion, but I really do look forward to engaging on the issue very soon. Thank you.
So, Suhasini, Haidar there, ladies and gentlemen, and joining me to discuss those trends, she enumerated some, going to see whether there are others our panel will identify. I'm delighted to welcome Tarek Osman, author of Islamism, A History of Political Islam, and a storyteller. Tarek, great to have you with us. Please do come and sit next to me and make me feel less lonely. Joining us online, we have Jana Puglierin, head of the Berlin office and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR. A very warm welcome, Jana. Great to have you with us, albeit not physically. And last but not least, Ricardo Borges de Castro, EPC Associate Director. Ricardo, welcome. Make yourself comfortable. So as before, I have some questions for our panel, and then I will come amongst you with the microphone if you have any questions to put to them. And Tarek, we heard there an enumeration of some of the big key trends as Suhasini saw it. What for you are the most important ones that will really shape our thinking about this new era of global power politics? It's on. You just talk. There we go. That's on. Definitely.
I'll just talk. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind invitations. First time in this city in 3 years. It's lovely to actually be here. Suhasini talked very much about probably geopolitical / geoeconomic trends. The notes I had when I read the brief that was sent from both of you actually were probably less tangible, but just food for thought. Mm. So in terms of trends shaping power, if I remember correctly, that was the question. I would say the first thing that came to my mind was to be able to provide. So I'm Egyptian, I come from the Arab world, and over this summer 2022, and certainly before that, I would say certainly in parts of Europe as well, as have been observing, I think there is an issue of provision. Just whoever is able to provide on the basic staples of food, of water, of warmth, of the basic tenets of life, I think that's a crucial dimension, trend in being powerful. Somebody mentioned, I apologize, I should have noted who exactly, but I think President Rompuy mentioned the self-autonomy. Fair enough. And I think that's certainly a route towards potential provisioning, being able to provide, but it's not the only route. I think there will be countries that will come together, and certainly on geopolitical / values will form some sort of networks together to provide for themselves, to be independent from other networks of countries of different geopolitical interests / values. The second trend that came to my mind when I received your brief was, I think, and I know it's a negative message, but I'm convinced, there are trends in the world right now that are feeding fear in different parts of the world. And I think anybody who thinks that that is going away is probably much more optimistic than I am. I think there are inevitable consequences of fear that will be with us in different parts of the world, certainly in Europe, certainly where I come from, in the Arab world, for a number of years to come. And to my mind, power, or one of the trends that will shape power, will be the societies, and I doubt it will be regimes or politicians, but I think the societies that will be able to effect some sort of a functional, realistic, not rhetorical, realistic balance between liberal values and the inevitable consequences of fear. And I think that will be a very difficult balance to effect. But those who will manage to have something like that, I think will be powerful.
Let's very briefly, if you will have another one.
Which I can't read. But,
do you want to have a look at it? And I'll come to Jana, yes, you can add it a little bit later on. So Jana, and I want to come back later on what that means. Leave it on now that it's on. What that means in terms of the way we think about ourselves, the way the EU and other global players think of themselves. But Jana, great to have you with us. And from your perspective, and as we look at those trends, we heard from Suhasini and from Tarek there. Would you see the broad trends in a similar way? Is there something else you would highlight?
I have 4, and I promise to be quick and do it kind of elevator pitch style. My first very much corresponds to what has been already said. It would be weaponizing interdependence. I think it's tremendously important who controls the flows of people, of goods, of money, and of data, and who controls the connections and the dependencies. So that is for me the first trend. The second trend is has been already also mentioned in one way or another. I would call it deglobalization. So this, and I think it comes as a consequence of weaponized interdependence. So, for example, when it comes to renewable energies, we see both China and the United States becoming more and more protectionist. We saw secondary sanctions, kind of the rise of export controls, data regulation, censorship. So a way to protect one's own terrain against the influence of others. The third one is, I think, a race for new technologies or for technological innovations, and who controls this. So who is kind of the master of artificial intelligence, quantum technology, data storage, semiconductor production, and also, I think that is linked to weaponized interdependence. Who has the critical raw material, the critical new industries to work on these technologies that will change the world, or that are already changing the world. And my fourth is demographic trends more broadly. So Europe basically being overaged and losing population, the African continent, I think, facing a huge problem, but also kind of a huge transformation, a problem, growing urbanization, and what kind of these demographic trends worldwide do to us, mixed with climate change, which has been already mentioned, I think will be of tremendous importance.
Thank you very much indeed. And Ricardo, complete the picture for us in terms of the trends, but also beginning to look already at what these trends should mean. How should we think? I was struck by what Tarek was saying about the fear and a balance that now needs to be in responding to that. And some of the points that Jana was making, echoing Suhasini on the deglobalization issue. I mean, Suhasini called it exiting globalization and entering regionalization. How do you see that and the way ahead?
Thank you, Jackie, and good morning, everybody. I agree with the points and the trends that were highlighted. I mean, not only by Suhasini, but Tarek and Jana. And I think, I mean, what they show, what these trends show, really is that and as we have said, I mean, the levels of uncertainty, and this is one of the trends. I know that these two are probably not so, it's very hard to measure them, but I would highlight two because it has to be, in a sense, also goes to what Tarek was saying in terms of how do you use trends, or you can manipulate trends to exert power, or how they might undermine your power. And these are two. The first one is the increasing level of uncertainty, volatility, and complexity of the global system. And so I think this, and it's the famous perma crisis that we have been discussing over the past year and a half, which means that decision makers and policymakers have a much harder time in governing, in providing, in being able to meet the challenges that both Suhasini and Jana were just referring to. And so my take in terms of the power of the instrumentalization of this, I would say that those that would be able to deal better, to handle better the perma crisis, and actually to be prepared for what might be the next crisis, those will do better than others. So I think this element of being able to manage the perma crisis, preparation for this, I think it will make a big difference on those that would actually thrive in the global system. Because I also think that we need to project this into the long term. Okay, what does this mean for us when we have an outlook to 2030? I think the second one, which is also difficult to measure, but I believe in all conversations that I have with decision makers or policy makers, is the speed of change and how technology, in a sense, turbocharges so much of this. And I know that in the afternoon we'll be discussing this more. But this sense of inability to deal with the, let's say, with the several present crisis, I think this really can make a difference of being able to have power and exert it or not.
Thank you. Tarek, can I just ask you, I mean, talking there, and Jana was talking about that interdependence, Ricardo about that perma crisis, but I'm wondering to what degree, when we look at this through a European lens, and we talk about the watershed moment, and we talked about that in our last panel, is that how the rest of the world sees this moment? Does the rest of the world sense itself to be in a perma crisis, in a watershed moment, or are we looking at it through one lens and others see it differently?
First of all, I love that I'm speaking on behalf of the rest of the world. exactly why I'm on planet Earth. Yes. No. Look, I come from the Arab world, so we have been in perma crisis for roughly 400 years.
Good point.
But speaking seriously, anybody with minute interest in international relations have realized months ago that this is not just a European issue or a new Cold War or a West versus Russia dynamic, that it has spillover effects that go way beyond that. But the point I wanted to answer your question with, which also links to the point I wanted to put forward in front of you, and I think it's also linked to what Ricardo said, is that there's no doubt that there are transformations going on right now. Now, obviously, this geopolitical watershed moment is colossal. Technology, Jana and Ricardo mentioned about it. I would say there is an economic transformation that is massive, has been going on for 20 years, very much being felt here in this continent. And I think it's one of the key reasons why the far right is on the rise and probably will continue to be on the rise in this continent for some time. And in my region, there's been a colossal question about the role of religion, and it's unsolved yet. What I'm trying to say is that amongst all of these things, especially when it comes to technology, I'm politically incorrect. So Ricardo was saying it depends on who will manage to influence these technologies or manage the power. I actually think that the train has left. Some regions will shape the future. Some countries will shape the future because they have already had immense accumulation of knowledge. The rest of the world, to answer your question, probably, with very few exceptions, will have to adapt. And the problem will be that in some of these adaptations, I think we'll find some societies, certainly some states falling, but some societies probably exploding.
And just to ask you, is the EU on that train or has it been left in the station?
The EU.
Honestly, as perceived by the rest of the world. And you're being their spokesman today on this panel.
Yeah, right. Look, Ricardo knows that. I'm not being polite. I personally think that the societal model that Europe has curated in the last 40 years, based on the last 400 years, with the exception of the wars, to my mind, is the most beautiful and most refined human experiment in human history.
Okay.
Full stop. However, I think that the notion of Europe, as a lover of Europe, who's not a European, looking from afar, but was educated in this continent, that the notion of Europe, realistically, without political correctness, is not very clear to many Europeans. And I think there are many versions of what Europe means is being put forward. And I think there ought to be some political leadership and intellectual honesty, and not necessarily political correctness, in defining and debating what does the European lifestyle mean? What does the European values really mean?
Okay. And that links to something Suhasini said when she talked about reversal of lifestyles, learning to live with less, learning to be happy with less. Jana, from your perspective, and I think Tarek was rather careful there when I said, was the EU on the train or still in the station? You also talked about that race for new technologies, access to raw materials and so on. Where do you think the EU is in this shifting world order? And we're talking about whether the rest of the world sees it the way we do. Has the EU woken up? Has everyone woken up to the enormity of what has happened in your eyes?
Coming back to your train, Jackie, I think we are on the train, but we have definitely taken a back seat. We are not at the front row any longer. And I think we have terrible problems adapting to this because we have been the center of basically geopolitical attention for the last century. We have been either, kind of the power hub and then trying to colonize the world, or we have been basically the battleground for the two major wars that had really global impact. Now we tend to think that we are the center of the world and that the war in Ukraine affects each and everybody worldwide, but it's no longer the case. I think we have definitely moved to the periphery when it comes to shaping the world, looking where the power is, and yeah. So we are not the most important battleground any longer. We are not at the heart of the trends that I just illustrated, but more so, I think the Europeans have also shaped the global multilateral order or the system quite a lot and have been playing a big role in the institutions. And we see now that our basically EU-centric or Eurocentric system is also no longer working. So this puts us under enormous pressure. And we have been looking through our Western lens very much at global problems, and I think the world realizes this and is not in agreement with our perception very often. So I think the EU is behind when it comes to my trends, when it comes to weaponizing interdependence, because it follows very much a market logic. Like looking at energy and Russia, our narrative, I mean, okay, coming from Germany, I'm especially guilty here, but I mean, not personally. But so Russia was dependent on us. We were kind of, as Europe, the most important buyer for Russia, but it didn't matter in the end. So I think weaponizing interdependence to us, although you could argue the EU has been doing it, is still, yeah, because we follow that market logic, not kind of, but in Europe, ideology does not trump the market logic. I mean, maybe in some member states, but overall it doesn't. So this is the first thing. And then I think deglobalization for Europe, we always want to be a powerhouse and not be dependent on China and the US. But I think both China and the US will force us more and more to take sides. And it will be tremendously important, but also very, very difficult to maneuver Europe through this. And then also when it comes to technology, I mean, that's no secret. The AI companies are not in Europe, the big ones. They are either in the United States or in China. And I think there we have super good quality of people and research, but then people just move to the United States and do their research there because conditions are better. So we need to get better with that. And then also demography wise, I already said this. So we need basically people coming to Europe to care for our aging population. Yeah, we need a new labor in force in Europe, but at the same time, we have tremendous difficulties managing migration. And I think that will be even more difficult in the future than less difficult.
Absolutely. Ricardo, you talked about uncertainty, you talked about the speed of change, and to go into that point of Jana's about interdependence, I mean, that is the EU's DNA. But how do you see now where we are? And do you think there is enough? We've already touched in all our sessions on the EU as a geopolitical actor. How much of a geopolitical actor has it been? And what does it need to do to realize its ambitions? Do you think there's enough strategic thinking about this moment?
No, I don't think there is enough strategic thinking about this moment. I see, I mean, what I've seen, and I say this because we were badly prepared, and if we can just look back, you know, regarding the pandemic, regarding the war, we were not prepared. These situations always came as if they were a surprise. So we keep on being surprised by these events or by these several crises that we are now facing. So I don't think now that even if, okay, and here I would like to speak a little bit about some of the paradoxes that these trends also sort of reveal, because if on one hand, some of the trends that both Tarek and Jana were mentioning would mean that in the long term, the EU will have less power. What the EU was able to show along with the West after Russia's aggression on Ukraine was it was able to mobilize power, that the power potential is there. Even, of course, I mean, we are going to be less and older. We are the economic center of gravity is moving to the east. And so, I mean, there's all of these trends in the longer term that will make our life a little bit more difficult. But I also think that in particular moments, there is, I mean, at least it shows that the will is there, that if necessary, countries will mobilize. I mean, a couple of years ago, there was this big report from the Munich Security Conference calling Westlessness. I mean, is this really what is happening now? I don't think so. Okay, I mean, are there problems in this sort of coalition of countries that support Ukraine? Of course there are. But what I think is that we also need to go a little bit to what President Van Rompuy says many times. We need to look at the hope parts of this. I mean, we need, because if it's all negative, it will be very hard also to mobilize people into a very difficult challenge that we have. And so I think that the EU needs, because I think all of these trends, and I'll finish here, to a certain extent, question what you were saying, the EU's DNA. And so if the world change, as we have been saying over and over and over the past few months, if there is a Zeitenwende, if there is un tournant d'histoire de l'Europe, if there is a watershed moment, then, I mean, we need to act accordingly to this. And I don't see that happening in a sort of, in a very structured way.
Thank you. And just picking up on your point about hope and that title of the book of conversations, with Herman, with Fabian, with Yanis, turning fear into hope. And you talked about fear, feeding fear, the trends that are feeding fear, Tarek. And you said we need to strike a realistic balance between liberal values and the inevitable consequences of fear. What did you mean?
I'll answer your question, but let me also be less careful, because I agree with you. I was careful. So since I'm here and since you invited me here, I probably owe you a level of honesty. The question, what I was trying to say is, I'm not particularly sure that what Europe means. So I was trying to say that there ought to be a discussion about that, because to put it bluntly but succinctly, I'm not sure that everybody is on the same train, or maybe there's different European players on different trains. So the question is, what could be done, and I think it is a debate, to get a passenger on the train rather than different passengers. And maybe, to answer your question, one potential food for thought from a lover of this continent to contemplate is that if there's one thing that Europe is without doubt, the leader at in the world, is again the idea of the way of life that has been achieved in this, or on this continent. This immense balance between respect for the individual, functioning, harmonious, almost society relative to many other places in the world, including in the West. I'm not comparing to non-Western, including in the West, and an extremely difficult, fraught evolution of the sociopolitics on this continent. And perhaps European blunt, again, not politically correct, but blunt answers from Europe's own experience on how to effect that balance I was trying to highlight between the real liberal values that have been with difficulty, with immense difficulty, nurtured on this continent, in these societies, with, again, the unescapable consequences of fear that will be manifesting not just in different parts of the world, like where I come from, but in this continent. And to put it succinctly, if in the countries that we are seeing in Europe right now having far right, if we see that they do not leave the sphere of refinement, cultural, socio-political achievements that have been achieved in Europe, if these experiences are corrected somehow, if Europe 10 years down the line achieved that balance, I personally think that's your seat on the front wagon of that train.
Thank you very much. Jana, coming back to your first key trend that you highlighted, and deglobalization. And Suhasini called it an exit from globalization and an entry into regionalization. Is it the end of globalization, or is it the end of what one might call unfettered globalization? So a different kind of globalization. And dependent on your answer to that question, what are the implications? What do we need to do to prepare for that new era?
So I think it's not the end of globalization as such. I think people will continue to trade with each other. Just look at, for example, the energy needs that Europe has. I think we are dependent on imports, and so I think it is not that we are all kind of retreating to our small islands, but I think what we will see is increasing fragmentation, indeed, increasing protectionism, and that especially European companies who have been free traders very much and have been trading with the world will be faced with different standards. So that, and then the threat of political secondary sanctions, that it is not longer possible to trade with both the United States and China in the future. That might be, might seem a bit far-fetched right now, but I mean, just imagine a kind of a Taiwan scenario. Just imagine, China tries to kind of militarily or not non-militarily, but attack Taiwan and kind of take it home, as the Chinese would say. That would cause a tremendous problem for European companies. So I think, and it goes, as I think Ricardo has said, it goes to the heart of our philosophy. So I think the EU's reaction, for example, to the Inflation Reduction Act, if the United States is not granting European companies exceptions. So we need to think about our reaction, about industrial policy. Some European member states have felt more comfortable with the idea of industrial policy, others have not. But I think we need to reposition ourselves as Europeans, and if the other powerhouses in the world use sanctions, use tariffs, use whatever, I think we will sooner or later be squeezed in a position where we need to think about protecting our markets as well.
Indeed, and that is an issue we're going to come back to. We have a panel this afternoon on economic security in the age of confrontation, and what does that mean? So we'll delve into some of that in more detail. But Ricardo, question to you, then briefly I'm going to come out to all of you before a wrap-up question, and if Marie will allow me, I'm going to steal 5 minutes from her session because we started a couple of minutes late. But I wanted to just touch on security and defense, Ricardo, because you've written a number of publications since the invasion of Ukraine, talking about the EU's, what you called, rude geopolitical awakening. You also wrote one about time to stop hitting the security snooze button. Your perception now of whether the EU has the capacity to live up to its ambitions. Herman said at the beginning of today in his speech, some member states like to think of the EU purely as market rather than might. Do you think there has been a significant shift now, and that the EU is capable, if there has been, of delivering on it?
I mean, I think it's clear that everybody now realizes that this is a key element of our, let's say, strategic autonomy, if we want to put it this way. Because the consequence, if we actually don't do that, it's that we're going to continue to be even more dependent on the Americans. And I think, I mean, we should also not be naive. NATO will continue for the foreseeable future, as it has been shown over the past 9 months, the security guarantee of Europe. So there's no way to escape from this. But we do also need to start thinking ahead and long term. We now have a president of the United States that is very committed to Europe and also to what is happening in Ukraine. We don't know if this could change in 2 years' time. So I think as Europeans, of course, I mean, the process of building strength in security and defense in Europe is going to take years, because the procurement, you know, the actual manufacturing of this type of products, they take many years.
But do you think that spur to do it is now there?
I mean, I think it was there very much after, you know, at the initial stages of the war.
No.
I think Jana could probably say better than I what is happening to the, let's say, to the security and defense Zeitenwende and to the decisions that Germany made at the time in February. Of course, I mean, it's a very important or a very significant step that both Finland and Sweden have applied for membership in NATO. So, I mean, there is a reinforcement of, let's say, European security, I think, apparatus. But still, I mean, we are not nearly there of where we need to go. And I think if we also will do this in competition with the Americans, I don't think we're going to go. I don't think we'll get there.
Jana, before I go out to the room, just one word on Germany and what was hailed at the time as a remarkable change. That speech by Olaf Scholz that seemed to turn German policy on its head. Since then, a lot of disappointment, a lot of sense that it hasn't really been. What is your sense of where Germany is now in that discussion? Then I'll come out to all of you.
I could tell two different stories. First story is really, if you would have asked me a year ago if that would have been possible, what was announced in the speech, but also already partly implemented, I would have told you you're completely crazy. Like, whom are you kidding? So for this government, led by an SPD chancellor with the Green Party on board, it is remarkable. The other kind of more negative part of me would tell a different story and would say it is at max the beginning of a process. The Zeitenwende decisions allow us to basically, if they are implemented, to be at the head of the game on 23rd of February 2022. But all the new obligations and all the new commitments that Germany needs to make or has already made are not covered by the Sondervermögen, by the special fund. And my biggest headache is that the medium-term budget for defense is frozen in Germany and it's not rising. And if it's not rising, the Zeitenwende is just a one-off cosmetical.
Indeed. Any questions or comments from our audience? I wanted to come back, Tarek, and thank goodness there aren't, so I can ask you this. To your comment earlier about is there one, where was it? Just, I did not see you, sir. Let me come down and give you a microphone. Always lovely to have you with us. If you could lean over and meet me in a spirit of cooperation. There we go, sir. Thank you.
Let's be concrete.
Joost van Ursel, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, sorry, I'm Joost van Ursel from The Hague. Let's be concrete. Mr. Borges, you talk, and the lady from Berlin too, on industrial policy. We had an industrial policy, which is called Boeing. That is industrial policy. Fighting for a place on the world market. And there is no project at this very moment steered by big competitors together, supported by the states in Europe to make comparable projects.
Okay,
and if we don't, we lose. And what's your answer on that?
I'm going to hold that question, Joost, because that really links much more to our panel this afternoon on economic security. I'm not going to forget it, but I'm going to hold it for now. Paul Christofferson.
We have talked a lot about regionalization. Where is Egypt and the Arab world placed in a regionalization? And second question, what is Europe's region?
Thank you.
Sorry,
very
what's the
much
second
indeed.
question? What's the second question?
Link that, and can I throw into that to add into it? Just expand a little bit, if you would, on your talk about that networks of values that you mentioned earlier.
Hear the second question.
You couldn't hear. It was about regionalization and where you are and where is Europe.
Again, I love that I'm now speaking on behalf of Europe. This is my day.
You get to
The rest of the world, and
task
then
here.
Europe. Yes,
Impressive.
to be the US in 5 minutes. Well, just one quick thing also, again, and really from somebody who's a lover of this continent as opposed to poking something, but just food for thought. I loved the point about might and not just market. And I loved what the president said about it's not just play of words. And I agree, there's thoughts behind it. But the question I have bluntly is, might, especially in an immense moment of geopolitical transformation, means cost at a time when that is super rare and difficult in Europe. It means, to be honest, I was a bit surprised that Europe has a rude awakening. Europe, two of the most, if not more than two, of the most important and advanced European players launched a campaign in Libya. 12 years ago now, and it was stopped midway, and the US had to intervene to effectively finish it. And that was on Libya, which is less than 200 miles from the European shores, the country that is not necessarily at the forefront of global power. So there ought to have been early points. I'll be quick. And third point is might needs also people willing to die. Now, people die for values. People do not die for markets. And that brings me back to the question, what is the European value that would make people willing to fight, and especially European people who have achieved that level of refinement of socioeconomic, I don't want to say decadence, but beauty of life? There are, to my mind, real questions to Europe facing the might point. I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but I'm happy to answer the Arab world over coffee or something.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, we are almost out of time. But Jana, I just wanted to ask you, going back to whether you want to use the analogy of the train leaving the station, or you want to talk about that key question that Herman raised about the EU, whether it is doomed to stand by powerless or to shape its own destiny. For you, the key priority as Europe looks to the future and to these challenges, if it is to respond to these global trends in the most effective way possible and meet those challenges. Same question to you all, 1 minute each, if you would. Jana.
Okay, 1 minute gives me two topics I want to talk about. First is market competitiveness, and just being the most attractive region in the world for the best and the brightest people who want to come and live in Europe. So I think we need to spearhead technological innovation. We need to be there with the US and China, and we need to make sure that we are best equipped when it comes to sustainable supply chains and all of this. And second, I'm very happy that Ricardo brought up defense, because that would be my second priority, because kind of military power is important still in the 21st century. And just the sheer fact that we cannot protect ourselves makes us vulnerable and open to blackmail. So we need a more joined up European approach. We need to strengthen the European pillar in NATO, but also through the EU procurement development.
Thank you very much. Ricardo.
I think it's important, just to final reflections. The first reflection is that sometimes we tend to approach trends as deterministic. They're not necessarily deterministic. We can try to reverse them, or we can try to bend them. So I think that's the first insight, because when we think of trends and where the world is going, we might feel that we are being pushed into that direction. To a certain extent we are, but again, if there is agency, if there is will, you can try to change that. Second point that I would make, because that was also, I think, in your reflections, and we've been discussing it, but we have not really put the spot on it. I mean, democracy and freedoms have been declining or decaying in the world for the past 16 years. So if I had a message of where we really need to work, and also to deal with this perma-crisis, with the speed of change, is really, it's to strengthen our democracies. If we can't be faster, we need to be smarter also. We need to be able to anticipate change. We need to be able to anticipate crisis and the problems that will come from these trends that we are already looking. So strengthen democracy, and make it, again, I mean, democracy was growing until 2005. So there is that story as well. So let's, again, it has been declining, okay, since 2005. Maybe this is the moment, we are in a moment of transition. We might be in this paradox that probably democracy will rise again.
I'm going to come back on that issue this afternoon in a conversation I'm going to be having with Ivan Krastev about the power of democracy. Tarek, you have the last word, briefly, if you would, in terms of your key priority to meet these challenges. And you can speak for yourself, not for any other part of the world.
You're now deflating my ego here. I actually don't have much to add to what Ricardo said. I really like the last point. It is, if there are priorities, strengthening the European democracy. But I would just add a tiny point, which is I would not just limited to the political scientists' scope of what democracy is. I would say strengthen, reflect, beautify, further refinement of the European experience that I think has made this continent powerful. This continent was not made powerful by its military might, was not made powerful by its economic policies, was not made powerful by its R&D. It was made powerful by the fact that so many people in the world look at it and say, I want part of that. I want to be part of that. Not necessarily to welcome them, because they will not be welcomed, let's be frank, but that the model itself survives and become an inspiration. That will give you the elusive thing, the soft power, dictate the terms.
And we haven't had time to talk about that power of attraction, that soft power, but something I hope we'll return to. Will you join me? I wish we had twice as long. Thank you so much. Jana, thank you so much for joining us. Ricardo, Tarek, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Marie, for letting me steal a couple of minutes from you. So as I said, we're going to come back on some of these issues later when we talk about economic security in an age of confrontation. We're going to come back on the power of democracy.